All right, welcome to the June edition of the Leptos Meetup. Super stoked to be with everybody again this month. I think this might be like a little bit of a shorter monthly, which is all good, but it's still going to be packed with great content. We've got Greg and Ben with us this month, and Greg's going to give us an intro to the 0.7 alpha release for Leptos, which should be super exciting. And Ben is going to give us a sneak peek preview of something very exciting that he's been working on sort of behind the scenes, which is a Pavex integration. So I will go ahead and bring you on Ben. Ben will go first this month, and then we will close out the show with Greg. So everybody, if you have questions, please ask them in the live chat. Again, welcome to the June monthly. So Ben, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. I wasn't here last month, so it's been a little while for me coming on here. And it's been a pretty busy month for us and for the project in general. So really excited to see what comes out as we go over the next month or so.
Yeah, for sure. You've been quite busy traveling around, doing some events, representing Leptos out of like RustConf and stuff like this. Yeah.
Yeah, not RustConf, but earlier
not
in
RustConf.
the RustConf is later. Earlier in the year, I did Rust Nation UK. We spoke there, kind of the first Leptos talk that I know of. And then after that, Rust NL. I gave a talk at the GoSim pre-conference on Leptos. And Rust NL was really cool for me because I got to meet the Dioxys folks and a lot of the other Rust UI folks. We talked about the proposal some of you might have seen where we improve Rust to make it a little more ergonomic for GUI development. And that seems to be moving along, and I'm really excited about that. Coming up this year, we have RustConf, as you said, in Montreal. I will be there. I'm definitely trying to get Greg to go there, and many other Leptos people as I can arrange. So I hope to see more of you there. I'll also be at Eurorust in Vienna, which I think is the month after that. So big travel year for me.
Cool. That'll be very cool, man. Vienna's great.
So I mostly have community updates. Let me toggle it over to share my screen.
Yep.
If I can find the window. I don't know how it should be fairly visible. The first thing I want to highlight is some lovely work done by.
Hold on, Ben. I think you somehow shared yourself in front of your screen, but not actually sharing your screen. Is that
you can't see the background?
Yeah, I can. It's just really hard to see. Maybe I should take myself off the stream.
Sorry about that. I did do that, but I can hide myself just as well. So let's see. There we go. Okay. So I wanted to highlight the work done by Vasily and Adrian. We now have a developing Rust book in Russian, which perspective is really weird.
Yeah. I was going to say this is really hard. We really only see a portion of the text.
I know. I can see the preview. Anyway, it's at book-ru. I'm going to try doing screen sharing the other way. But like I said, I want to thank them for doing this work and for developing it. I have no idea what any of this says, but I imagine it's useful for other Russian speakers. Vasily has asked that. Here we go. I'm going to share screen the other way. Share. Screen. Yeah. Okay. That looks a little better.
Much better. Yeah.
Okay. Vasily has asked that if any other Russian speakers has feedback on it, please share that feedback. I don't, as a non-Russian speaker, I don't have a ton to say about this other than I love that it's getting done. And if anybody else wants to do other languages, I'm happy to work with them to set up the infrastructure. So lovely work from them moving forward. Besides that, you already mentioned, I spent a lot of this month building a Pavex integration. For those of you who don't know, Pavex is a web server like Axum for Rust that Luca Palmieri is developing. It's trying to be more like Ruby on Rails or something, a integrated one-stop shop for your API projects. It has a really unique dependency injection system that I don't really have time to explain, but it's very interesting. And I've almost finished getting that working with Leptos. So I know this isn't a terribly interesting example, but you know, it renders routes and shows images and CSS, and I'm almost there. More interesting, I think, is that Luca Palmieri has said yes to coming on next month at our meetup and talking more about Pavex in general, so he can give you the whole rundown on that. And I'm really excited for that. So
it's awesome.
Let's see. Code-wise, it is rough. It has writing an integration is somewhat difficult, depending on how far away that integration is from something we already have. Axum and Actix are pretty similar now, especially with some of the latest changes. But Pavex does all sorts of fancy injection, dependency injection stuff, and in a whole different process. So it's a fair amount of code to write here. The project is public. I wouldn't recommend using it yet, but you can find that at the Leptos Pavex repo in my repos on GitHub. And we'll post a link to that somewhere in the chat probably. And yeah, that's my updates for this month. I'm extremely excited to see Greg talk about 0.7 some more. I got a little bit of a preview of it because this integration is only designed to work with 0.7. So it's been fun finding the different issues and the niceties. So
right on. And just to confirm, so what is the goal with Pavex in terms of a release schedule, or is the idea to kind of have that available for public use like towards the end of July when Luca comes on, or do we have any idea of what sort of timeline we're looking at there?
So in general, it's almost there. I have an issue with server functions and an issue with meta context tags, and then I want to throw it out for people to debug. So I'm expecting this is going to be done, or at least beta in a week or so. Pavex is a little bit interesting because it is in a closed beta right now. So if you're interested in that, you kind of have to apply for early access to Pavex, and he usually lets people in every couple of weeks or so. So if you're interested in that, you know, you want to go to pavex.dev and fill out this form to get access, right? So.
Okay. Awesome. Great. So there you have it, everybody. If you didn't catch that, just look for potentially a beta release in about a week, and you might want to go over to pavex.dev and sign up for early access.
Absolutely. So
awesome. All right. Well, before we move on, Ben, was there anything else before we move on to Greg?
No, that's it. I will turn it over the floor.
All right. So thanks, Ben, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
All right. And Greg, how's it going, man?
Great. How are you?
Good, good.
Thanks for hosting us as always.
Absolutely. I probably should take this time to apologize to our German and our friends in Germany and Denmark for scheduling the monthly meetup at the exact same time as kickoff for the Germany-Denmark game for the Euros. So I posted in there. Nobody else has any excuses, but I understand if if anybody living in Germany and Denmark aren't here this month, I totally understand.
That's all right. The good news is it's on YouTube, so they can always watch it later.
Exactly.
Thousands do.
Yeah, exactly. We do seem to have a lot of Germans using Leptos. I think that's honestly like a Rust thing I feel like
Well,
yeah.
it's funny when we did our little like Leptoberfest thing this year of like people making contributions. There were a handful of people who like put in their information to get like we mailed stickers out to people or whatever, and all of the people who we mailed stickers to actually were in Germany. There were no contributors. I don't know if it was the Oktoberfest connection got people excited or just the German community with Rust and Leptos, but we're very happy to mail people stuff over in
I
Germany.
mean, I've got like a theory that I mean, I live in Germany. I'm married to a German, and I've got a theory that like, the Germans, there's something about the Rust compiler that speaks to like the mentality of the German, which is like precision and no room for ambiguity. You know what I mean? And everything must be in order,
That may be true. I'm one half German American immigrant family, so it's entirely possible that this is a connection.
Yeah.
Why don't I throw my screen up here?
Absolutely.
Clicking through.
And Stephen, I see your question in the chat. When Greg is finished with 0.7, we'll get to your question. And anybody else, if you've got questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So, and we have
and I'm also totally happy just to do unrelated questions throughout. So use your discretion when you want to put stuff up, and I'm happy to pause for Q&A too.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, so first of all, why don't I do the customary? Is this text big enough? I think this is probably hopefully good for people. So I just opened up the 0.7 alpha release notes. You all, if you've been following this stream, you've been seeing me talk about upcoming 0.7, or if you're in the Discord for a long time, there's a PR I opened that is in a branch with like hundreds of commits in it now. It's been a pretty big rewriting process, but things are going really well. It's sort of confirmed a lot of what I was trying to do so far. And so I thought I would maybe walk through a few of the high points of this release, and then actually walk through a little bit of a demo app, just showing off some of the new improvements. So, the first thing I would say is just, in this getting started section, there are starters for Axum and for Actix that you can just clone with Cargo Leptos. The commands are right here, and those will get you going. I will be publishing basically bug fix. I think I can do like additional alpha releases that Cargo Update will pull in, or you can always go for the Git branch a little later on if you want, and just knowing that may break occasionally. And then, stick feedback in the PR itself or in the preview channel in Discord. I've gotten a ton of really helpful feedback, especially from Jinxit and others who have been building stuff along the way on this branch. And I've already gotten bug reports since I made the alpha yesterday, and I've actually found bugs myself while I was sitting here while Ben was talking and I was trying to make my demo slightly prettier. I found a couple bugs too. So it is in an alpha state. There will be things that are broken. There are a bunch of things that are still missing, but a lot of the core stuff is there. The reason I decided to release the alpha now was it's at the point where pretty much all the examples in the repository compile and I think work. So that's pretty great. So a couple of things, I'll say more about async and await and resources and suspense during the demo, but there have been some improvements there. And I think even better APIs than I've talked about in the past couple of months. So I'll talk more about that. We have some improvements for signals and the cleanup process when you have nested signals and closing some issues that could cause like memory leaks for people accidentally, and some examples there. I added some read and write methods on signals so that instead of like .get or calling as a function which clones, you can call .read, which just takes a reference. And that is sort of trying to stay in touch with the Rust not over cloning mentality. It takes out a lock guard, and then you can access that. A couple of nice little features. I'll say more about the HTML shell in a minute. This prop spreading, I'm pretty happy about. I think that this one in particular will help a lot with people building custom component libraries. You can currently spread some attributes onto components that will get added to HTML elements that those return. This really extends that a lot and gives some nice new syntax for things. So you see like on this component that takes spread of all these things, only this one is a prop that the component defines. And the rest of these are all just HTML attributes or DOM, stuff that's being stuck onto it. And then I'll actually say more about protected route in a minute too. I tried to stuff a lot of these into the demo. And then there's just a list here. I would say if you're going to try out the alpha, check this list of things that are still missing. These are things that are still missing that I haven't figured out a good way to do yet, or that aren't quite implemented. So if you are trying to just take your own existing app and you change 0.6 to 0.7 and compile it, there's a good chance that it won't work because there may be some missing things. If there are other things that people find that are missing that aren't on this list, just let me know. But so I think maybe now I'll actually just go and show the little demo and walk through some of these things in some more detail. So this is a pretty simple, very simple demo, right? Really basic application that apparently I don't actually have running anymore. Oh yeah, because I was testing out another nice little thing. Good. Great. Okay. So there's a little homepage. There's a user, like imagine you're getting a user out of the session on the server or whatever. Say there's one server function figuring out what the user is, and then you've got a timeline for this user or whatever. And so when I load it, here we are. I can go to the admin page. It says, hey, you're logged in. If I log out, it redirects me to the homepage. It tells me I'm not logged in, no posts. If I log in, here we are. So it's a really basic, right? Hopefully that's pretty easy to follow, but it actually ends up showing off a bunch of the new things in this particular release. So if I go into the application, actually the first thing I wanted to say, right, was just something you actually don't see in the code that you write, but which is a big change in the Axum integration itself. So currently the reactive system isn't send or sync in the sense that basically any async work that you do during server rendering has to happen on the same thread. And Axum is designed instead to use Tokyo to be able to handle your response across multiple threads, which is a way of like spreading out load on the server so that if there's one thread that's has the capacity to do some work and you have a response that's being handled on this thread, it can just send it over here and keep responding. We had some weird hacks in the current Leptos Axum integration to keep things pinned to one thread. So one of the big changes is just that by making all of the reactive stuff send and sync, we were able to take those out, simplify the integration, which should improve server performance, at least in some cases, and at least is going with the grain of kind of what the server framework intends. And that doesn't change anything for Actix because Actix keeps things pinned on a single thread anyway. So you don't actually see that in the code, but it is a change that was really worthwhile. So this just looks like the ordinary, setup. There's no real change here. Leptos route signature is a little bit different. We provide a static file handler now in the integration instead of just boilerplate in your app. But there's nothing really interesting to see here. If we go into the application, first thing you might notice is just that the imports have changed. So rather than the kind of use Leptos, everything, this is really one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years that I just should have done differently from the beginning was this is really bad for docs and discoverability. Because if you go to the Leptos docs right now, you just get the main page of this has like every single struct and enum and trait in the entire framework is all on this page, and there's no module structure. So one of the things we're trying to do slowly over time is build a little bit better of a module structure. We'll still export everything from a prelude, so you don't need to worry about it right away, but you can migrate over to like use Leptos, reactive graph, signal, and it's a little better for discoverability of things. And similarly, I just broke these out in the router and the meta too. But so then in terms of the actual application, the first thing you'll notice if you open up one of the starters is this shell. So currently the HTML shell of the page, in other words, everything that's shown right here, that's all kind of hard coded into the integrations. One of the reasons that we have Leptos Meta is that you didn't have somewhere that you could just type title like hello worlds. And if I add this title in here and I just take out the other title we have lower down, and then wait for Rust to do its thing, you'll see like this actually just affects the HTML of the page. So we put this in user land, essentially. You can adapt this however you want. You can, take out the auto reload stuff, the hydration scripts, like these are just regular components. Oh gosh, I forgot about this bug. So you can insert whatever scripts or anything you need. If you need something to run before hydration, you can put your own script tag up here. If you want to put the style sheet in here, whatever, you can do that. And this should be recompiled. And oh, look, it's already refreshed. We've got hello world, right? Good, you can change the title. So that's just one small thing. It makes it feel nicer to me as a web framework. And this we only call this on the server. And then in the body, in the client rather, we're just calling this hydrate body app, right? So we don't use the shell. We use the shell here on the server. All right, that's just a nice little small thing. Thing number 2, this is just the setup for my my silly little auth system that's either true or false with no password. And then we get into an app. So this first one, you see one of the changes I'm also trying to make over time is going more in line with normal Rust naming idioms for things. So this would be create server action in the past. This also helps with docs and with discoverability because now the docs for server action new, you're on the server action struct page. So you get all of the methods and associated functions for a type in one place. But more importantly, we simplified the types on these a little bit so that when you have a resource, it only takes the return type. It doesn't also have that first generic that it has right now, which is the input. It still has this reactive input for the first argument, but you don't need it in the type signature anymore, which is useful for when you're doing things like providing them via context, which I'll actually do in a second. But so yeah, basically, we've got our login button, right? This is the action that toggles whether we're logged out or logged in. And then we've got the user, which is a resource that, like we're always doing, reads from the version. So every time we toggle the action, it'll refresh the resource, provide the resource via context. And then here I just make this little logged in derived signal, which isn't super complicated. It basically just says, user.read is going to return me the value of the signal at the moment. So it's going to be like an option because it either has loaded or it hasn't loaded, and then a result server function error and whatever user is. I don't even remember, a string. So this is just saying, are you logged in right now? And then, we've got the action form. It's going to say whether you're logged in or logged out. None of this stuff is at all different from anything that the framework has been doing up to this point, which is great, right? Like I realized as I was putting together this demo, it's a little bit boring, and that's probably a good thing because it means that there are fewer breaking changes, relatively speaking. The next kind of interesting thing to say, you see I've got this flat routes here instead of routes. This is just small optimization. This could be routes. The nested routing is relatively more complicated. So if you do have something like this where you have a flat routing structure, in other words, none of these routes have a child, you can just use this flat routes, and it's a little more optimized for this case. And you'll notice that the paths here, you have things that would previously be like path equals this and path equals admin. And now they have these static segment, or this could be something like, static segment, param segment, ID. This is another kind of optimization so that we don't have to, in the browser, ship the code for parsing things that we already know can only be one thing. So it saves, honestly, dozens, up to 100 kilobytes of WebAssembly, which is good. It might be useful to make something like path admin. I think you tend to define your paths once or twice, and maybe it's not a big deal. So it's been kind of low priority. But my ultimate vision is that you end up writing something like this, which can follow the same sort of structure that we currently have. So not something to worry about if it freaks you out or you don't like it. You'll notice on this protected route, this is something that I actually fixed pretty significantly. A version of this in 0.6 is pretty broken because protected route in 0.6 only checks the condition once. It's not reactive and it doesn't work with suspense. So you can't read a resource in it currently, and it won't react to changes. So it actually is broken in this case where we go to the admin page, we log out, we don't get redirected. It works currently in the case where we do this and try to go to the admin page, but only if the resource is already loaded. It doesn't do any kind of suspense. So the new version just essentially works properly. Like it works the way you would expect with suspense, with reading from a resource. And so you can see, like, I just go in here and I check this user resource and see if it's me logged in, and it gives it true. So that's just fixing a long broken component. This is sort of the server functions for getting the user ID, for getting posts. There's nothing that interesting. Here you can see I pulled a resource out of context that I just provided. Okay, and so now we've got the user, and we want to load posts for that user. And what I'm imagining is not something like a blog, but maybe something like a social media timeline, right? Where you don't know what content you need to show until you know who the user is. And currently there's a problem where you can't just, you can't wait for a resource inside another resource. So if I open my sort of 0.6 version of this demo, currently you might try to do something like this. So you have user, and then inside this resource, you say like, okay, check this user, see if they're logged in. If they're not logged in, return an empty set of posts. And if they are logged in, then actually get the post for that user. This actually doesn't work. It's broken currently. You might think that this could work, but this doesn't run reactively. So what you're saying currently, if you have a resource that reads from another resource inside here, or even if it gets it up here, like if you put user.get here and you have user, these two resources are created at the same time, and this one is going to be none, and it's never going to load the data. And it's a real problem. These kind of waterfalls aren't ideal, where you're loading some data and then loading some more data. The feedback that I've heard from people a number of times is that sometimes they just have to do it that way. They just actually have a resource that depends on another resource, and currently you just can't do it. Currently you actually have to create a suspense that reads from the first resource, and inside that suspense, then you create the other resource. And there are all sorts of issues that come about with this. A lot of the weirder, like hydration mismatches, kind of bugs like that, come about in exactly that situation with the nested suspense and resources. Okay, so going back to the current version, basically the big API addition here with resources is that you can await them. So user here is the user, this resource that we got out of context, and I could call .get, and calling .get will return like an option, and instead I can .await it if I'm inside some async, and .await will actually wait for the value. So in other words, this will never be none. The reason it's like, okay, some user is because that's what I returned from the server function, but this isn't, waiting to make sure it's some. Once you await it, it won't progress with this other resource until the user resource is loaded. So you actually can chain together resources now, which is a big improvement when that's what you need to do. And you can also do that inside a view. But you can also access resources the way that you currently do with .get. So it's basically like you can either do them synchronously or asynchronously. So in this example, right, you see like a transition like we currently have, and then there's this suspend, which just is a small wrapper that lets you use a future in the view if the thing that it returns could be used in the view. So here we match on, again, we await for this resource, and then we just say, if you're logged in, we put the user ID. Otherwise, we say you're not logged in. And that ends up being, this, right? So this transition is going to wait for, and of course, like that's reactive. You can see it's reacting to the change in the resource. But here, again, right, like you don't have to do these sort of, the other way to do this is, I guess, match user.get And since we're already doing a match in this case, it's not the worst thing in the world. That's probably too many braces in the wrong place, but you understand the idea. So this kind of null checking of the values of resources. So again, this is just sort of a nice, convenient thing in one sense to be able to await the value of a resource and just use it, but it also fixes some of those edge cases. And then you can also create like derived async values, just like we have derived signals. And so you can actually have a reactive async derived signal, which this one is just gonna wait, doesn't clone, takes a reference to the set of the posts and is going to give you the length of it, which is where this length comes from. But again, this is kind of cool, right? This one, the difference between resource and async derived is that the async derived will actually just auto track reactive things within this one async block, and it will rerun whenever they would change, like any other, like a memo would basically. And the resource has this separate block, and then resources send their value from the server down to the client. Async derived are just derived values, so they're almost just like a function call, but you can use async in them. And the idea here is basically you don't need to serialize and ship this number of posts. If we look in the HTML that actually gets sent, what gets sent down from the server to the client is, the shell that we created, the actual page, and then it streams in one template that's the first suspense that we had, or transition, another template that's the second one, and then it sends down each of these. This needs the nonce in there, doesn't it? It sends down each of these resources, but the resources it sends are only the user and the posts. It doesn't need to serialize and send the number of posts. Since that's this async derived, we're saying that this can just be derived on the client or on the server. We can just call this and we can await this resource because we have the resource wherever we are that's been serialized. And so we've got this, this awaiting inside suspense, but you've also just got regular things like we could normally do. So this for example, we can pass the posts resource into the props and do post.get and then like unwrapper default. So the resources now are almost a way of like uncoloring async functions, where you can use them as async all the way down by awaiting on the value, by putting it in an async block, or you can use them like you do now synchronously and just have it be an option. And depending on the situation, you may want to do one of those or the other one. If you're passing it into props, like I can't do posts.await in here because this isn't inside an async and there's no way to make it inside an async. But I can do the .get when I'm passing it into some component. So the for component doesn't need to know that it can potentially have a resource that's going to it. But the suspense will still know not to render the whole thing until that resource has finished. And I guess the one other little thing, the reason it wasn't actually running when I started was one of the things that's hard to show in a live demo because it's a compile error. If I have something like this, P tag, right? And I add an ID to it, except that I have a typo on ID, we will actually get a compile error that there is no method called IDD, but there is a method called ID, and maybe that's the one that you want instead. So the compiler will actually catch invalid HTML element attribute names rather now. And it's entirely possible that there are bugs like this, but I think that we handle most of the cases okay. Yeah, so for example, a data dash or a custom attribute name with a dash in it is fine. But if I did something like just p foo, this should not be fine. If people start complaining to me about HTMX and how it uses things that aren't real attributes or whatever, I guess you can make an extension trait that includes all the HTMX things and that actually checks them too, which is also cool, right? The power of Rust, except that because it has the dash, it treats it as a custom attribute. So it's fine anyway, whatever. We'll all survive, right? Yeah, so I mean, I think that's most of my demo. It feels like I've been working on this thing for forever. Except the last thing that I wanted to show, and this may just take a second because I had it in release mode earlier. Oh, I switched from nightly back to stable to get my Rust analyzer working again. So the biggest one here, right, is hopefully all of this doesn't seem too crazy to people. When I checked earlier and compared the two binary sizes from the 0.6 version of this demo with the broken protected routes that doesn't really work, and the broken nested resource thing that doesn't really work. So the 0.6 was 560 kilobytes of WebAssembly. Some big chunk of that is SIRD for these various types that we're sending via the server functions and the resources. So that was 560 kilobytes. The 0.7 version was 477, which when I did the math, that was like somewhere between a 15 and a 20% reduction. So that is pretty good in my mind in terms of reducing binary sizes, getting down there. If folks watched the stream, was that last month? They may have seen some of the experimentation with code splitting in the router. That is something that 0.7 is ready for, and I think the actual code splitting technology needs to mature a little bit, but we're ready for that. So that will be an even bigger reduction in a sense. But for now, one of the big goals with this release was kind of smaller HTML output, smaller WASM binaries. And for those who hate all of my stupid marker comments that are currently in the DOM when you do things, I hope that they just enjoy this beautiful application of pure HTML with fine-grained rendering, with no silly marker comments, except in a very few places, like at the end of lists that might have another list after them or something. Stuff like that. There are a couple places we need it, but I was able to remove all of the hydration IDs out of the DOM and most of the marker comments and stuff. So you end up with much cleaner HTML, and cleaner HTML is also shorter HTML, which is less bandwidth for your server, for your users, and so on. So hopefully that's kind of win-win-wins all around. But questions?
That's awesome. All right, yeah. So first of all, Ben, I'll go ahead and bring you on the stage. Greg, should I remove your screen as well?
Why don't we stop my screen for now, and I'll probably put it back up at some point. But
okay, cool. All right. So first question. This is from Steven, and this is kind of this is not a 0.7 specific question. Steven asks, newbie question here. I'm also very new to web dev. How would you advise to handle cores in a Leptos CSR app? We'll appreciate pointing me in the right direction. Thanks.
Ooh, okay. Cores in the Leptos CSR app, I would say, is typically done by whatever your host server is. There is a cores plugin for Tower, and there's a cores setup for Actix, and you can pretty much just use that. That's what I'd look at if I wanted to go for that.
Yeah, I think it depends on your particular scenario and what you're running into. Most of the time when I have cores issues, it's when I'm trying to use APIs that don't want me to use them from the browser directly to the API. And it involves setting up some kind of server that I can control, that I can make requests to, that does the request. But cores is a pretty broad topic. I don't know if people may have experiences or problems.
Yeah, exactly. Then we can move on. So now, Ben, you were kind of already answering some of this in the chat, but I think this would be interesting to maybe expand on a little bit because I think it has broader implications as to kind of handling integrations that people are interested in building and Leptos, just generally speaking. So the question is, what is the process to make an integration like we have for Axum and Actix, but for Rocket? This person specifically stating that they really like to use Rocket with, or would really like to use Rocket with Leptos. And I know there's also been some talk, people wanting to port component libraries over to Leptos. So maybe this is an opportunity to kind of maybe address that specifically, but also just more broadly, how we think about those kinds of topics. Ben, looks like you are muted.
How about now?
Yeah, you're good.
All right, so I'm going to start with the integrations because component libraries are a little bit different. So basically, an integration for Leptos, in the general sense, is just a set of handlers for whichever framework it is that take in, your Leptos app, like your Leptos app, and the request from your framework of choice, whether that's Actix's request or Axum's request or Actix's HTTP request, I think is what they call that. The spin one takes its own thing. The Pavex one doesn't even have a request. It has bits of a request it'll give you. So basically you take all that stuff in and you write a bunch of functions that will generate the response correctly, right? Which in our case usually looks like a function like this one here that will take in the context that you want, the application function, the Leptos function that we need to run, and then we'll handle the request, generate a response, handle it, and send it back. And then besides that, there's a bunch of other utility things in here, generating routes and adding them to the framework's router, passing data from the framework to Leptos itself, and then maybe back out. In a general sense, I don't think Rocket would be too hard to do because Rocket's pretty close, I think, in structure to, say, Axum. I can't remember if they used the HTTP request response types or not, but that usually makes it easier. If you're interested in that, I could talk about that for ages. And if you'd like to try that, I'm happy to help in a general sense. Component framework. Sorry, go ahead.
Just to pause on the integrations. Anyone who was been around from the early days, Ben might remember this. There was a while where there were not integrations. There was just a bunch of boilerplate stuff that I had in the templates or in the examples when there were like 5 examples in the repository and Cargo Leptos didn't exist and all this stuff, right? And there's actually almost something nice about that in a way, right? Like it's helpful to have the integrations. They're really useful, but ultimately, like if you, and see, I knew I was going to just put my screen right back up for, as soon as I started talking here, I'll just throw it up here, entire screen. There we go. Yeah, like in your main.rs, right? I don't actually know how Axum works. Whatever. I don't think this is right? But like there's
close.
I don't know. We're just gonna. I know it's gonna have async something because it's Axum. But there's like nothing really wrong, right? With just like something like this, right? Like this will actually give you something reasonable. The reason we have the integrations is that there's a bunch of other stuff that like the router expects, things in context, setting up the reactive system. But ultimately, like in a sense, they're not magic. They're just running some code on either side of your application. So the files that contain the actual integrations right now are pretty daunting because they're both in one file and there's a lot of dot comments in them too. So they're like 1,500 lines long and whatever. That's my fault. But the integrations, it should be pretty straightforward to create a Rocket integration. The integrations basically, and Ben said this, they have to do like 2 things. One is tell the server which routes your application has in it so that it can tell the server, hey, if somebody requests any of these routes, we want Leptos to handle that. So it almost like plugs into the server's router because all the servers come with routers and says, hey, just if you hit one of these, just let Leptos do that. And then, like and that's what the Leptos routes thing is really. And then to basically, whenever it hits one of those, to set up the reactive stuff, run the thing and send it. So there's kind of a lot of boilerplate, but I think it should be pretty straightforward. And I've even tried to migrate some of this integration stuff to like refactor it out so it can be shared a little more anyway. So as long as a server supports streaming responses with like the capital S stream type, I think that's probably the most important thing, because so much of our stuff is streaming based. I didn't mean to stop. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ben.
Oh, you're fine. I mean, this has come such a long way, right? One of the first things I worked on was the Axum integration, and I wrote the original version of Leptos routes to prevent you from having to define routes in both Axum and in Leptos. A lot of this convenience is just kind of obscuring the idea that it's basically a few different handlers under the hood. So yeah, I agree. It'd be pretty easy. The only other thing I might mention is, besides the integrations, which we do have, for server functions, you now have to write traits to extend the request and response types so that we can plug them into the server function implementation. That lives in the server functions crate right there, server function. You can take a look at all that stuff. We've got extensions for Actix and Axum, requests and responses. I don't think there's much interest for us personally to have more than Axum and Actix officially, but if any community members want to step up and build one of these things, we're happy to help. I've got Spin. I'm soon going to have Pavex. Somebody's maintaining the one that starts with V. Remember what that one was called, Greg?
Yeah, Viz.
Viz, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, and that was a good example of something that came in as a contribution originally, then kind of wasn't, the original contributor didn't kind of update it, and then it kind of felt like, okay, when we made bigger changes, I didn't want to also be maintaining this for a relatively lesser known framework. I mean, Rocket is big enough and slow moving enough that I think it would be easier for either an individual or for us to maintain a Rocket integration if somebody wants to create it. But yeah, and even some of the other ones, I don't know. I go back and forth on what should be in the repository and what not with anything in the ecosystem, because more stuff in the repository means basically more on mostly our plates to maintain as time goes on. But it also means that stuff doesn't break if someone just kind of, doesn't have time to work on it anymore. Like, I worry every time we do a major release, right? Like 0.6 to 0.7, every crate that uses Leptos will have to update to 0.7. And if you use a bunch of crates in the ecosystem, they all have to update before your application can update. And like, the churn gets complicated when there's a bigger ecosystem, which is a great problem to have. But
I mean, I've certainly been considering aggressively pruning our examples so that we don't have to update as many of them.
Yeah. Well, and I will say during this process, the examples have been great. I've been moving some of them into that projects directory now. And if people want to contribute new examples, projects is the place to put it. The CI setup is actually really good now. So we have end-to-end testing of a bunch of the examples that have caught actual bugs in 0.7 while I was updating things. So that's part of why it's been such a kind of slow development process, just partly my time, but also partly that it's actually the examples being there and being tested in CI have caught a bunch of issues that it's great. I mean, that's exactly why people put a lot of time into adding tests and stuff for those. So thanks to everyone who contributed to that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think we have another question here.
Great.
Unless we finished with that, Ben, do we want to move on?
I think that's enough for now. I could talk about it forever, but I don't think everybody wants to hear that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Vasily asks, are you planning to simplify destructuring return types of resource by adding more methods like existing and then? It can be cumbersome in 0.6.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there are a lot of things, because so much of this really was rewritten. There are a bunch of methods that I added over time in other parts of the framework that I haven't necessarily added into the alpha version yet, like that resource map, resource, and then. I mean, part of the idea of the being able to await things is that then you don't have to do all that null checking. But still with the results for server function specific resources are a great example of something where there's kind of boilerplate that you're hitting, and it's actually cool. I mean, Rust, it turns out is a really nice programming language, and so you can do things like define methods that return different kinds of futures. So I kind of buzzed by it in the example, but if you await something, it waits for the resource to be loaded and then clones the value like a .get. But if you do like .byref.await, it waits for it to be loaded and then actually returns like an async lock. So you can just get a reference to the list and not clone the whole thing. Things like that. So we could have like, I don't know, resource.map.await or something. What naming is hard, right? That like maps over the result type. There are all sorts of fun things that we can do. And of course, you can also do any of that stuff in extension traits in your code too. And if there are things that you find useful, we can then bring them in. You can like create an extension trait that extends all resources to have and then, and if it's useful, and then is one that's already in the framework, so it makes sense to keep. But yeah, so that's another thing. If there are things like that that are just missing, feel free to just comment on the PR or make PRs to the PR is a great thing to just port stuff over from the old to the new that are helper methods like that. Really helpful. So I will probably forget by the end of this stream, but if you leave a comment on the PR right now, we can include and then at least.
All right. I'm looking in Discord right now. I don't see any other questions. So unless, yeah, looks like that's it. So unless there's anything else that you have, Greg or Ben, then I think we're done for this month. I do have one little housekeeping item. I know on the last show or on the last in the last meetup and the one before, we had two different comments about getting the video in 1080p. We're doing this on a free version of StreamYard. It's 720. It is what it is. One of these days, I don't know, we'll be able to take super chats or something, or if we ever, I don't know, want to buy a subscription or something to StreamYard, or maybe I'll just bite the bullet and do OBS. I don't know. OBS is hard when you're having a bunch of people on a stream though. So anyways, but I just wanted to acknowledge that we had a couple comments about that, and there's a reason why we're not 1080p, and it's just that we don't have a subscription. Actually, one question just rolled in really quick.
Awesome.
What would you say about your priorities between SSR and CSR? I'm not really sure what that is alluding to. Priorities in terms of how you personally would develop your project or Leptos in general? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'll just start talking and then feel free to expand on the question in the chat if you want to say more. They're
development and focus.
Sorry.
Development and focus. So I would assume Leptos framework development.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of ways of answering that. They are both super useful. There are some use cases where client-side rendering is the only thing that matters. Using Tori would be a great example of that. But another good example of that would be, I have an application that's designed for people to log into at 9 a.m., work on for 8 hours, log out, and open up the next day. It doesn't matter if it's server rendered. Search engines don't need it. It doesn't matter how fast it loads. So like that's one category of CSR only is great. Totally fine. Server-side rendering, really important for most applications, particularly when you're using WebAssembly for the client side, because there are plenty of, I mean, the mainstream devices support it, but there are plenty of weird devices people might be trying to use your website on that don't support WebAssembly at all. So you want to think about graceful degradation when that is the case. I think of my like old like Kindle that I used to read stuff on, right? If I hit a website that was just totally blank, it was probably because the browser was using something in JavaScript that it didn't support. As far as priorities between them, I think that the most awkward thing is that there are features of the Rust language that are designed for multi-threaded environments, which the browser is not. And there are elements of the Rust web browser ecosystem that are explicitly not send and sync. And working with that tension is hard in development. And it's been one of the things that's kind of shaped the way some of these APIs in 0.7 have worked out versus 0.6, and like finding a way where we can strip out all of that pinning to one thread stuff in Axum so that your server is performing well. without causing too many headaches in the browser where there are all these not send types. I mean, that's been tricky. So there are some small trade-offs there, I think. I mean, I would say in a way, client-side rendering is basically a solved problem and has been for several years. And, Leptos was sort of the first, Rust web framework that really was there on the performance element of that. And Dioxys is now too, and that's great. Server-side rendering, there are more interesting questions about how that works. Not how that works, but sort of how these two things integrate the best, right? Like the pure server rendering story and the pure client rendering story are basically the same thing that they were 20 years ago and 10 years ago. And then the place where those meet up is what's kind of interesting and what's continuing to develop. So we'll be, renewing some of the work on island stuff and client-side routing with islands on the server for the sort of feel of a client-side app, but keeping more of it on the server. That's something I find interesting and I'll do some work on later this summer. But yeah, I mean, I would say they're both priorities. I guess the asterisk on that always has to be the pros and cons of using something like Leptos are really different in those two environments. So CSR, the drawbacks of client-side rendering, which are like empty HTML page and you wait for the scripts to load before it renders, those are magnified with using WebAssembly, right? Because it, generally speaking, will be a bit slower to load than JavaScript. However, if it's a situation where that doesn't matter, like a dashboard app or like a thing that people are logging into, then the extent to which that doesn't matter is even more so. And server-side rendering too, the Rust use kind of amplifies that, because one of the benefits of server-side rendering is you get this really immediate response to the user. And especially with streaming, like you get an immediate response to the user before anything else happens. And just to, make you earn your hosting privileges here, I'll pull the app back up. And just while I talk, add some delays in here. The great thing about streaming server-side rendering is that, let's do like a really long delay. Oh, that was the wrong server function. That's okay. So I'm just going in and I'm going to put some delays on our server functions here, right? Right now, they're actually synchronous and we're on localhost. And so it looks like everything happens immediately. There we are, get posts. But if you put in some delays, you can actually see some of the effects of streaming here. So point being, server-side rendering is great because it gives you that very snappy initial response, right, with just the HTML coming from the server before the JavaScript, before the WebAssembly have loaded. And even more so when you are streaming, because now you've actually gotten something from the page and those other parts are just streaming in later. And, you can do that with client-side rendering too, of course. The interesting thing is that just like client-side rendering amplifies some of the disadvantages of using WebAssembly, like the loading time, server-side rendering also amplifies some of the advantages, because like rendering HTML on a Rust server is going to be a bit faster or a bit lower memory use or scales better or whatever than rendering some HTML on a JavaScript server. All else being equal, right? Which is a big caveat, I guess. But so in an interesting way, right? Like they're both priorities. I suspect that most of the interesting use cases for something like Leptos come from the fact that you want to integrate with some other Rust code. And most other interesting Rust code is usually going to be stuff that runs on the server. But that's not necessarily the case all the time, right? So maybe you're compiling some interesting Rust stuff to WebAssembly and using that. So that was my long answer.
I'll throw in some stuff here. I mean, we get a fair number of questions about static site generation, SSG, and CSR, and SSR, and ISR, and all of the things, right? I think, as you mentioned, CSR is client-side rendering is pretty established. Not much has changed in that in a long time. I don't see a lot of things changing there. SSG is not really one of our core interests. We've got a somewhat half-baked implementation in Leptos right now that a contributor contributed. And we'd love to have people work on that if that's something that you'd like. But I don't think any of us are going to be doing that too much. On the server side rendering end, I'm most excited about the WASM splitting work. If you've been paying attention to the Discord, someone has made a beta that will split your WebAssembly bundle into little bits, which can even further decrease your WASM bundle size and increase your time to interactive and that sort of fun stuff. The other thing I'm keeping an eye on is Dioxys's binary patching, which can make hot reloading faster to some degree. We've kind of pushed it to the limit of where we can get without editing the compile process. We do have hot reloading that'll do like HTML, CSS patches, but Rust does have to be compiled at some point. And if we can make that faster, that'll be big for us. Besides those goals, I think priority-wise for developments, I'm trying to focus on improving our tooling and improving our onboarding a little bit. We've got a great book that a lot of people have put effort into, but I'd love to see a few more directed real-world examples. And I think Cargo Leptos needs a bit of a tune-up as far as that goes. But I'm really excited for the work that we're going to be doing over the next few months.
That's actually a perfect segue into this next question, if we're ready to move on.
Yeah,
let's do it.
Yeah, so Tony asks, are there complete basic examples of SSR on fly.io using Leptos with auth, etc.?
We have an SSR example. I believe we have Start Axum has a fly deploy script. I don't think that has auth in it. Actually, I'm pretty sure it doesn't. We do have an auth example that you could probably copy paste the fly Docker file into and have that work for the most part. But as a complete thing, no. Kind of in a general sense, from my view of examples, I'd love to have like an e-commerce example and like a blog example or something with auth, with more structure to it. A lot of our examples, teach one topic, kind of focus on that, and real world use cases would be great, I think.
Yeah, I know there's like a couple of to-do MVC with like Axe, to-do MVC with Axum, and to-do MVC with Actix. Then there's, of course, Hacker News, or maybe it's, I don't know, Hacker News is Axum and Actix. And then there's the Islands version. But yeah, I get what you're saying there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of starter template stuff like that is great to have, and it's great to have in the projects example if people want to contribute stuff. And it is one of those things, right? Like the more combinations of different things you start sticking together, the more maintenance there is, unless it's something that's you then create another layer to make it really modular, right? So I think more people creating starter templates that have things like that are great, right? Because like Ben said, we have all the pieces of that. We have projects that have auth setups. We have, I mean, I think that the Docker script book is literally the Docker script that we use for the website which is on fly.io, right? I don't know. I think we updated it 6 months ago and it just sits there chugging along doing its thing. But yeah, I don't think there is an example that puts those pieces together. But then, right, the thing is, somebody asked, well, do you have an example that's on render using, this other auth library? And it's like, okay. The combinations are endless, right?
Yeah. It is. I just realized I do have a blog example that has auth and that I've deployed to fly.io, like one of my personal blog examples. I can dig that up and find it if that's something you're interested in. So.
I also will just say on the topic of like static site generation and things, right? One of the things that comes up with some frequency is people who want to use Leptos for the HTML templating features, but actually aren't doing anything in the client at all, just want a server templating thing that feels like JSXC that they like, that they're familiar with. And there are always questions about how do I get rid of all this weird other stuff? And I get these reactive errors, and I get like all this junk, the hydration markers and stuff in the code. And so, while we were sitting here, I just typed up like a little bit of an example of, cargo init bin and cargo add leptos 0.7. And it's just, this couple line function that's like got a hello function. I had this as a component, but I wanted to prove to people that there's like the component macro doesn't do anything magic, like setting up the reactive system. So I took that out. Like, this is just print line calling hello dot to HTML. And, you can just run it and it's just generates HTML, which is like the most boring thing in the world. But one of the things that I've been trying to do over time is make stuff more modular so that you can just do this. And then you can be like, oh, I actually just want a static site generator or whatever. And you just have a pre-built, templating thing like this that's nice and that you can use. So there are places that we're moving further in that direction as people want it. And then I guess moving in the other direction entirely, like some of the stuff I've shown in past months with like integrating with GTK, or I was just messing around doing an experiment with Rye that works like Dioxys, where you're running your code as a native binary and controlling a web view. So a lot of the work that I've been doing for 0.7 is all about kind of decoupling things so that they can be used in different combinations more flexibly.
I mean, that's always the trouble, right? You've got pure server, you've got pure client, you've got client with fetching, you've got pure server with fetching. There's so many different combinations of these things. And almost all of them you can do with Leptos, but providing documentation and support and examples for everything is a challenge.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, Tony says, lol, writing my next SSG in Leptos.
Beautiful.
Yeah. All right. Well, then if there's no more questions, I think we could probably call it. I thought it was going to be a short show. We still managed to go over an hour. So
I was going to say we had beaten an hour, but then someone asked another question. So
it's never a short show. I know it's great, right? I'm happy to just yap away as long as people want. So, but thank you so much, everybody who's watching, and thank you for all the questions. And
thank you.
Sure.
If you're not in our Discord, come find us, ask more questions. We're happy to help. If you're going to RustConf, you might see me or Greg in a few months. And I hope you all have a great weekend.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you all on July 27th for the next meetup. So take care. Until then.
Thanks so much. Now I'm trying to quit Vim.
You're stuck forever.
I know. I'm typing Q exclamation point over and over. Why isn't it leaving?